Good morning and welcome to today's briefing at the Jerusalem Press Club. I'm Talia Dekel, CEO. As the UN General Assembly for 2025 wraps up today, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is set to meet up with US President Donald Trump to discuss the latter's 21-point plan to end the war in Gaza and create a pathway for a future Palestinian state. More questions than answers remain about its potential success, given all that is at stake, domestic pressures to both oppose or accept it, and of course, the likelihood of the Hamas terror group actually accepting it in the first place. However, a feeling of tense hope can be felt in the air here in Israel. With us to share his insight is Professor Jonathan Rynhold, head of the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University. Professor Rynhold is an expert on US-Israel relations, Israeli foreign policy, and the role of political culture in foreign policy. Professor, thank you very much for being with us here today.
Thank you.
So let's just start off with a very general question. What do you think the chances of this meeting actually producing results are?
Well, I think that there's a good chance that at the end of the meeting, Netanyahu will say yes, but. The question is how vague that will be and how much Trump will be satisfied with a vague answer. The thing about the plan is that from what we've seen, it doesn't specify an order in which things need to be done. So it does talk about disarming Hamas, but it doesn't say exactly when that should happen. I think that actually implementing the plan will be a lot more difficult. And I think that actually getting Hamas's support will be a lot more difficult. But the fact that the Arab Gulf states are on board and Qatar's on board, and the fact that Israel is currently acting militarily in Gaza all point to more pressure than normal. But on the other hand, Hamas will interpret the recognition of a Palestinian state by European countries and Commonwealth countries, including Britain, France, etc., as a victory for their strategy politically, and that may stiffen them. So I think, to summarize, there will be smiles in the press conference between Trump and Netanyahu and some kind of acceptance in some kind of a way. But I think that going from there to actually getting Hamas's support and implementing the plan is a much, much, much harder path.
Thank you for that. So let's dig a little deeper into some of the points that you had mentioned. First of all, Hamas. It's always easier to talk about others before we talk about ourselves. Senior official Ghazi Hamad told CNN last week that Palestinian civilian deaths were an acceptable price to pay for the terror group's actions, among other things that he said. And as you mentioned, of course, the recognition of 9 countries during the General Assembly. What do you believe that there are anyway other significant remaining interests that the group might actually have in agreeing to the deal that will eventually essentially see to the release of all 48 hostages, which are of course its strongest card in any current or future interaction with Israel?
Well, I think a lot depends on how scared they are of Donald Trump. I think that, Donald Trump is investing, a lot of rhetoric into saying this is great, it's an opportunity, I'm backing it, and everything like that. And their fear would be that if they say no, that he will just give this Israeli government carte blanche to finish them off. By finish them off, I don't mean that there's not one single person in Hamas left, but to finish what remains of their conventional forces, which is not that much, and a complete takeover of the Gaza Strip. So although that may not be very popular within Israel itself, Hamas will have to take into account the nature of the Israeli government and the fact that Trump is very fickle and he can very easily change his mind. And that is I think the the most significant factor that could change their opinion.
Understood. Moving on to Israel, if the prime minister himself refuses to sign the deal, either because of domestic pressures from his own constituency or coalition partners, or perhaps his own personal disbelief in the benefits of the deal, how do you think this will impact the U.S.-Israel relationship, given President Trump's fickle mood and policy?
So if Netanyahu says no before Hamas have answered, which I doubt he would do, but if he does that, that would put Israel in a position internationally that it hasn't really been in since 1956, which is to have everyone against it. And because within America, Netanyahu has nowhere to go. That is that he can't bring in the Democrats against Trump because they are far more critical of Israel than the Republicans, and the Republicans in Congress will not go against the president. And then what would happen is that this would then give a green light to the countries that recognized a Palestinian state and the groups that are trying to throw Israel out of UEFA, the World Football Association, and to ban Israel from Eurovision. It would give them a green light. So it would lead to a much deeper isolation of Israel. And the thing about these things is once they're done, they're much, much harder to undo. So he will have to take that into account. But we shall see.
Okay, one more question about Prime Minister Netanyahu before we move on to some of the other players that you mentioned. Prime Minister Netanyahu is in fact President Trump's last meeting on the heels of the GA. Do you think this gives him some sort of, is this a problem for him being last in line, given that the president already sat with so many other leaders relevant to this deal who were, part of talks on it?
I don't think so, and that's because there's been a hell of a lot of consultation between Netanyahu, his close advisors, particularly Ron Dermer, and the administration in shaping this plan. That doesn't mean that it's Israel's plan. It's not. It doesn't mean that there aren't things in it that the Israeli government and Netanyahu don't like. There are those things. But he's already had a big input, and being the last person is actually an advantage before the press conference, because it gives him like the final word. So he was there at the beginning and the end, but not in the middle. I think that's about as good as it's going to get for an Israeli prime minister.
Interesting. Thank you for that. One last question on Netanyahu that just came in, sorry, and then we'll move on to US policy specifically. Netanyahu recently told the leadership of Judea and Samaria, or the West Bank, that now is not the time for annexation. Of course, this comes immediately before the talks. Is this a signal of goodwill to the negotiation partners? Why do you think the timing?
It's because the settler organizations. Sorry.
Bless you.
Just a coincidence that I sneezed then. The settler leaders and the far right members of the Israeli government convinced themselves that Trump was going to support an annexation of large parts of the West Bank and, in effect, the depopulation of Gaza by the Palestinians leaving. And that's their absolute dream. And now it's clear from this plan that, as we said, Mr. Trump says things in order to gain political leverage, not in order to represent a policy. And they've realized that is the case here. The point of all those statements was to gain leverage from the Arab side rather than to implement them. And Netanyahu is now signaling to them that this is not the time, because it would lead to a major break with the United States, and it could lead to the collapse of the Abraham Accords, and it could even lead to the collapse of the peace with Egypt. And so I think that he's saying that, and I don't see him having a problem in his government by not implementing an annexation.
Understood. Specifically on the point that you made regarding the policy towards Palestinians in Gaza, and you rightly said that beforehand there was President Trump's call to to relocate the populations elsewhere. Even specific countries were named. So in your opinion, this actually reflects not a change in American policy, American foreign policy towards the region, but rather it was simply used as leverage for what we're now seeing in the negotiations?
Look, President Trump has several key principles on which he operates, or instincts. The first is that he only decides anything at the last minute. And in that way, he's similar to Netanyahu. And that in itself is not necessarily a bad way of conducting foreign policy. But there are other things. So he says a lot of extreme things like we're leaving NATO. Yes. But very often that's done to pressure the other side into making moves they wouldn't do if they weren't under that kind of pressure. So in the end, NATO has agreed to up its contribution, right? So the European countries. And every American president since Richard Nixon has wanted that. Only Trump has succeeded, and he succeeded because he threatened to leave. And it's the same here. It's not that he necessarily didn't think that that plan was viable, right? It's just that he wasn't committed to it. It was just thrown out there. He allows it to grow. He sees what happens, and he's not committed to it. So he changes his mind and moves to something else because his big picture goals are that America should play a smaller role internationally, including in the Middle East, and should only really act when its vital interests are at stake. In other words, if there's a threat to the homeland or a threat to American citizens abroad. And so it didn't really fit this big plan. The only reason that it had a credibility to it is because Trump thinks very much in terms of deals, transactions, and it looked like it was a real estate deal, and it looked like he was saying that America could make a profit out of all of this. And that's another aspect of his of the way he conducts foreign policy, but it was always at odds with the fact that he really doesn't want to commit American troops abroad unless it's absolutely vital for the US.
Understood. I will point out, though, and this is a great segue to another question that's come in. President Trump did threaten to leave the JCPOA, and he did at the end, very much so. However, now we're seeing Britain, France, and Germany reinstating snapback sanctions over the weekend. So moving on to Europe, if we can, what message do you think this sends the Islamic Republic about European policy in the region, given the latest move?
So in some ways, the snapback sanctions have more power precisely because the Europeans recognized Palestinian state. In other words, what they're saying to the Iranians is we're not going to be deflected. Even in our most pro-Palestinian modus operandi, we're still going to do the snapback sanctions on you. You can't use the Palestinian issue to divert us from that. And the thing with that you mentioned about President Trump and the JCPOA is important, because what it says is that if the other side doesn't respond in some way, then Donald Trump will follow through. If the Arab states hadn't come up with a willingness to put lots of money into Gaza and come up with plans, then he might well have gone ahead. That's the point. But he's not committed, right? So had the Iranians done what he wanted, and I think that, you know, in the earlier part of this year, he seemed to be taking a much softer position towards them. He only hardened his position because they rejected it. So I think that in the scheme of things, this snapback by the Europeans is good news for Israel and bad news for the Iranians, perhaps even more so than we might have thought.
You mentioned the transactional or kind of motive of the president, and there's a big question looming over Qatar, which of course is a party to these talks, and of course has played a significant role in both October 7th and everything that's transpired since. And we understand how deeply many of our Western governments are entrenched or the other way around, how Qatar is really rooted itself within our institutions in existing democracies. One of the things written by one of your colleagues, Dr. Kobi Michael, overnight was that if this deal does go forward, Israel needs to find a way to prevent Qatar from continuing to act in a significant way in the region, specifically in Gaza, of course, with the Palestinians. Is there a way Israel can actually see to that, given the decades of work that the regime has done to implant itself in these states?
So, in many ways, the Qatari role vis-a-vis Gaza is less problematic than the Qatari role in Western democracies, in the sense that the Qataris in Gaza are intermediaries. And it's precisely because they support Hamas that they have leverage over Hamas, because they give them something that can be taken away. And that was Netanyahu's thinking up until October the 7th. And that's why he supported Qatar's role, even though it turned out to be a huge mistake. So it's not that I think that Qatar's role in the Middle East is a wonderful thing, but it does have at least some upside. Their role, and also Americans have their biggest base there, so they're reliant on the US. But their role in bankrolling anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and often anti-Semitic things on university campuses and in institutions in America and Britain, and Islamist associated organizations with the Muslim Brotherhood and all of that, that is pernicious to democracy itself. And it gives them all sorts of leverage, and really that Israel has no direct leverage on this issue. But what it can do is highlight what's going on. And I think there'll be no shortage of politicians in Western democracies who will be worried about this, whether they're not necessarily those who are receiving the money, right? But there'll be plenty of people in the opposition in government that will raise this issue, and it will embarrass institutions, and it will embarrass governments. And in the same way that the laws on money laundering have been really become a lot stricter in the last decade or so throughout the world, I think it's quite possible that the laws about openness, about investments, and who's doing the investing, why they're doing it, what the payoffs are. I think that, we might see a congressional committee investigating that, because it's something that quite likely Republicans and Democrats very rarely would agree on, and that there are lots of Republicans and Democrats, and there are lots of Americans and lots of Europeans who will not like this idea. And in the wake of what's happened in Gaza and Qatar's role being more widely known, I think that a political campaign to highlight this issue in Western democracies is the way to go.
Very, very clear. One guest is asking, in addition to what you already said about Hamas's the potential of Hamas to actually accept this deal, what role could they play feasibly in Gazan society in the future? And if they don't have assurances about their own existence going forward, again, how this plays into the likelihood that they'll accept the deal.
Okay. So the first thing and the most important thing to say is, the stronger Hamas is, the less the chances of a good future for the Palestinians in Gaza and for Israel. It's really as simple as that. As you mentioned before, from Hamas's perspective, the more Palestinian civilians that die, the better, because Israel gets the blame. And that's why they build the battlefield in a way where you have 500 kilometers of tunnels in which the fighters hide, and in the way, their human shield is the population. And that tells you all you need to know. And while we might be very critical of aspects of Israeli government policy, any Israeli government of any color, of any ideological bend, would have exactly the same problem. Because Hamas is really akin to Al-Qaeda or the Nazis. It is a death cult, and there is really nothing positive one can say about it. Now, as for its future role, the key issue that has always been the sticking point is the disarmament of Hamas. So Hamas is willing to be Hezbollah. What do I mean by that? They're willing to not be in the government so long as they can retain their arms to dictate to the government. Because if you don't like it, we'll kill you, right? That's Hezbollah in Lebanon, or at least it was. So that has always been the sticking point. Now, one of the good points, I think, of this plan is they're saying, well, if Hamas doesn't agree to the ceasefire, then we should start implementing the plan in those parts of Gaza under Israeli control, right? So hand them over to someone else. That's obviously very difficult for this Israeli government to accept. But that in itself would allow for the development of an alternative government in Gaza, while retaining the threat that Israel would continue to operate militarily against Hamas. And that, I think, is quite a clever element of the plan, even though it's very hard to implement. It's certainly a credible threat. In terms of Palestinian society, I think the way to think about this is that there have been generations of Palestinians who have been subject to the most extreme propaganda against Israel. And whereas, between the Six-Day War and the First Intifada in 1987, such things were moderated by day-to-day contact between Palestinians and Israelis. And, lots of them had, business connections and all sorts of things which humanized Israelis. And so they might not, love Israel politically, but they didn't demonize every single Israeli. But that hasn't been the case now for 30 years. Since Israel withdrew initially from Gaza and with the Oslo Accords. So changing that, particularly after the terrible suffering, will take a long time. Just to give you a sense of it, it took until 1967 for a majority of West Germans to believe that Hitler wasn't a good leader who had gone too far. So if in a country which before Hitler had a democratic system and which had a civil society with trade unions and universities and all of that, it took that long. That gives you a sense of how long it will take in a society which lacks all of those things. It will take a very long time, but it is not impossible. And during that time, Hamas and its ideology will be a factor, and it will be something that will constantly be challenging any alternative regime in Gaza. The trick will be to build up political capital by being successful. In other words, in terms of improving people's lives and their sense of dignity. And that those things are very hard to do, and they take a long time. So Hamas will be with us in one form or another for a while. The real question is less about them being around and how strong they are and how much they can blow things up, both literally and figuratively.
Very interesting. It did. You're very right about what you said about Germany, and of course, it takes several generations to re-educate, but then now we're seeing the opposite, where there is a rise in Holocaust denial. But that's a whole nother webinar. A very interesting question came in now about the European recognition of the Palestinian state, whereby the journalist is saying reports have shown that in each case, Britain, France, and Spain, so forth, there have been internal political reasons for the move rather than a proven principled position against Israel. And specifically asking about the UK, popularity polls found Starmer to be the least popular PM on record, and these were published after the recognition. Do you think that these acts of recognition achieved their domestic political goals? In terms of strategy?
So one needs to understand, if we take Keir Starmer and Labour in the UK as an example, you probably tell from my accent that I know a bit about
I'm
that.
sure that's why it was chosen as the example sent as well.
But. Right. Okay. So if you take that, it's not the general public. The general public don't like Keir Starmer and Labour, and it has very, very little to do, if anything, with Israel and the Palestinians. But in order to win an election in Britain, it works not on what the general public thinks, but how people in marginal constituencies, in areas where there's a close vote, are going to vote. And there are about 50 of those, with a significant number of Muslims. And in the last election, a Muslim political party for the first time ran, and that drains votes mainly from Labour. And what that means is that what Keir Starmer's trying to do is, in part, pacify those people to keep them within the Labour vote, because that can swing a whole general election. 50 seats either way, that's huge. The other thing he has to do is, Keir Starmer is far more centrist on everything, including Israel, than his party. His party is very much more anti-Israel than he is. And so in order not to have done this, he would have needed something from an Israeli government. Like, if he could say, well, there's going to be negotiations, or the government's committed itself to a plan after Gaza, or anything, he could have avoided doing this. Because, as you rightly say, there is no practical benefit to this to anybody. It is not thought out. It breaks the normal rules of recognition, which are you have to physically control the territory. It's not clear what borders it's within. It has no mention of the Israeli hostages. It seems to be, it will be understood, whatever its intention, as a boost for Islamists and Hamas all over the region. And so, yes, one has to see it driven by domestic political concerns without any sense of strategy for improving things in the region. But one also has to say, enabled by an Israeli government that couldn't give the countries an excuse for not doing this, because countries generally are cowardly, not brave. And this is brave in the sense of being reckless. And so it's unusual, and I think that is the way to understand it.
Well said. We are almost out of time, but there is one last question that's come in, obviously about the Israeli political scene, given that there's a scheduled election in about a year. How do you think that these coming weeks, or what ends up the result of the talks with the US, how this might play into the Prime Minister's political strategy going forward as we approach the general elections?
So, because in Israel, it usually takes about 3 months from the date an election is called to the actual election. One needs to think that a prime minister doesn't want to wait until he has to have an election, because then he can't control the circumstances in which you go to the polls. And that means that from now on, we're in a period where the prime minister could decide it's better to do things now and have some control over things. And so if this ceasefire agreement does work out, right, it could be a good time to ditch the far right. They will bring the government down. He will look very, in Hebrew we say mamlachti, very statesmanlike. And he may judge that since he cannot win again without gaining votes in the center, that this might be a good time to go for things. Alternatively, he might decide that he needs to hang on as long as possible, because really since October the 7th, he's oscillated between about 45 and 50 seats for the coalition, which is well short of a government. And that the best thing to do is just to hang on and wait as long as possible and hope something will turn up. And given that's the way he generally acts, I think that that may be what happens. But sometimes the far right might decide that for their own reasons, this is the time to blow things up, and that they want an election now, and that they would benefit. I don't think they would objectively, but it wouldn't be the first time that political parties made miscalculations.
All right, thank you so much, Professor Jonathan Rynhold, head of the Department of Political Studies at Bar-Ilan University, and I think our first expert to find a reasonable translation for the word mamlachtiyut. Thank you so much for your time.
My pleasure. Thank you.
And thank you to my colleague, Jonathan Beck and Matthias Sakal, for facilitating this event. JPC is wishing everyone a happy Jewish New Year and an easy and significant fast for those observing the Day of Atonement on this Wednesday evening and Thursday. Goodbye, everybody.
Goodbye.